A man in body armor was shot and killed today by Hillsborough County Deputy Sheriffs. This is something that is occurring more and more often nowadays, and we need to be on our game as deputies, as police officers. And we're going to go into a deep dive now to figure out if there's any lessons learned, or even just to say, hey, you know what? Great job, Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office. Stay tuned. Okay, so today is the 24th of April. It is approximately 7 days, well, it is actually 7 days after the FSU shooting, in which a armed person came onto the campus and opened fire and ultimately killed 2 people, injured a total of 5 other people. 6 total were injured, including himself, and he lives. Today's incident involves Hillsborough County Sheriff's deputies having contact with a male. These are the details that we know. This guy was dressed in full military battle dress uniforms, fatigues. He had body armor with a tack vest on. He even had a comms headset, which is kind of crazy. You don't really see that too often. And he was indexing an AR-15 style rifle that apparently had a loaded magazine in it. The time frame was 7:24 hours when multiple calls were received. The subject was on a public sidewalk. They had rush hour traffic, civilians everywhere, people in their cars, taking kids to school, from what the chief deputy talked about in this briefing here. Potentially target-rich environment. It was just kind of crazy. But as we listen to what the chief has to say, you know, I want to make some comments on some key questions that I had come up to my mind just as a 20-year law enforcement professional in this area that I think might be of use to you if you're newer in the field, if this is the first time you've ever encountered or heard about such an incident in this particular context. So stay tuned. Let's listen into what the chief deputy says here.
7:24 a.m. this morning, just south of Causeway and Providence Boulevard, we received multiple calls to our dispatch center. Those calls were from concerned community members here driving to traffic. Let me paint the picture first. 7:24 a.m. Parents taking their children to school. Community members going to work. What were they calling for? They saw a man, our suspect, dressed in full battle fatigues, army fatigues, if you will, a tack vest with body armor, a headset of communication on his head, and a fully loaded assault rifle. Imagine a mother or a parent taking your child to school, looking to the left or looking to the right and seeing that man. Immediately, multiple deputies responded to the scene. Deputies arrived on scene. Multiple commands were given to the suspect. Drop the weapon, drop the gun. He did not comply. Again, multiple commands. Drop the weapon, drop the weapon. So de-escalation, that's what we're trained to do. At 7:38, after multiple commands to drop the firearm, 3 of our deputies fired on the suspect.
Okay, so we hear that the suspect was given multiple commands to drop the weapon. Drop the weapon, drop the weapon. The suspect refused to comply and ultimately was engaged by the deputies. Great job on the deputies. Of interest to me is the fact that the deputies were, one was a 30-year veteran with no prior officer-involved shooting. The second deputy was a 1-year on deputy with no prior officer-involved shootings. And the third deputy was only 6 months into this profession and also had no prior officer-involved shooting history. That's crazy to me because as a supervisor currently in patrol, looking at the squads that are out there nowadays, they're very young typically, you know, people that are in their early 20s that are coming on board and don't have a lot of experience. So those of us that do have experience, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we are training each other up and that we are running what-if scenarios, that we're sitting back during, you know, little BS sessions at 7-Eleven or whatever the case may be, or even at read-off, that we are actually engaging each other's minds to think about, hey, what would you do if something like this presented itself? Now, coming from a legal perspective, you know, there was a question that says, hey, does the law permit an officer to shoot a person perceived to be a threat based upon how he's dressed alone? or if he's just carrying a firearm alone. No, but in this case, the answer is definitely yes, because you have a totality of circumstances that dictate that this person who is dressed in a way that communicates that their intentions are not necessarily peaceful, and they're refusing lawful commands when engaged by law enforcement professionals. They're in a target-rich environment. It's 7:30 in the morning and on a populated street with civilians everywhere around them. There's businesses everywhere around them that they could potentially just suddenly flee into and cause an active shooter type situation to occur. And, we as deputies and as officers are held by the objective reasonableness standard that's set forth by Graham versus Connor. Specifically, the U.S. Supreme Court has held that the use of force must be objectively reasonable under the totality of the circumstances, judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene. And in this case, this includes whether the suspect poses an immediate threat to the safety of the officer or others, whether the suspect is actively resisting arrest or attempting to flee, or the severity of the crime at issue. As it applies to this particular scenario, like I mentioned before, the guy's armed with a rifle, he's refusing commands, he's not communicating otherwise with regards to his intent, he's in a heavily populated place, and he's perceived as a threat, and they have to act, because we as law enforcement professionals have a duty to protect people from imminent threats, imminent harm. There's also key case law that supports the use of force when armed suspects refuse to comply. Mentioned here in my research was Plumhoff versus Rickard, 2014, where officers can use deadly force to end a dangerous threat. Then, of course, we have the classic Tennessee versus Gardner, 1985, where deadly force is permitted to prevent escape only if the suspect poses a significant threat of death or serious physical harm. Important considerations here is the presence of the weapon alone doesn't automatically justify using deadly force, but it's the totality of the person's behavior, the totality of the circumstances, the setting that is at hand, okay? So again, keep in mind, not everything in police work is going to be black and white according to the Florida State guidelines and the statute book. There are times where you're going to be faced with situations where you're going to have to make a judgment call. You're going to have discernment. You're going to have to do the best thing that you understand is right to do at that point in time. The worst thing that you can do most often is nothing, okay? So just keep that in mind, stay encouraged, stay plugged in, and stay trained up so that you're able to handle this situation as effectively as these deputies did in the future. Good luck, stay safe.